There appears to be a magazine shortage right now in the firearms industry, and it's something that's starting to be a little bit more apparent if you're in the market for magazines. And this is something that you should have a lot of, because at some point in time, if you can no longer access additional magazines, you're going to find yourself in a very bad situation if you only have 2 or 3 for whatever firearms you plan on running. And I recently picked up a Sig Sauer P320 X-Carry Legion, which is a really nice firearm, but when I went to go start sourcing magazines for it, I realized that I was running into a little bit of a challenge. And I found this singular P320 full-size 17-round 9mm magazine in the entire city of Minot, North Dakota, and it was the only one that there was, and I bought it. Now, keep this in mind, because there's a lot of reasons for why this magazine shortage is happening, and this video is really more of a heads up for you to try to make sure that you get what you can while you can, especially with everything ramping up in the sense of overseas conflict right now, okay? So, I went through all the major sites. We got Midway, Brownells, Primary Arms, all those different sites that offer things like magazines. And a lot of them are out of P320 magazines. And now, this applies to a lot of other manufacturers as well, but at the end of the day, I'm looking for P320 magazines specifically just because that's the new firearm I acquired. And keep in mind that this is the firearm that police and military are transitioning towards or have already transitioned to. Now, even if you go direct to the factory, even if you go right to Sig Sauer's website, right? They have a lot of the magazines available. Of course, they're at full price compared to what you get at other outlets, but even some of their magazines are out of stock, especially when you're talking about like 21-round magazines, right? So I started trying to figure out, like, what is causing all this? What's going on here, right? And understand that even Gun Mag Warehouse, which is like a huge outlet of firearms magazines, they only have the 17-round 9mm standard, but like everything else is out of stock. Now, I understand that the P320 is very popular, but that should also mean that there's a huge supply of magazines in order to support such a popular firearms platform that currently is just hard to come by, apparently. Now, like I said, the adaptation is huge, and we have to keep in mind that with overseas conflict and the possible deployment of military assets over there, well, that suddenly could mean that there's a high demand for a lot more P320 magazines, right? And then you can apply the same logic to any of the firearms you're seeing used overseas by other militaries, especially from NATO. So we're talking about firearms like Beretta, CZ, there's a lot of them on the list, okay? Now, Mec-Gar is a huge manufacturer of magazines for many different manufacturers. They do Beretta, CZ, Kimber, Ruger, Smith & Wesson, Walther, Springfield Armory, and Sig Sauer. So Mec-Gar obviously is having an issue with some production, right? Well, I called them just to figure out what was going on, and honestly, it was very easy to get the answer. 60% of their staff are out right now due to the thing that's still around from 2 years ago. That's in their Italian manufacturing plant, which means that 60% of their production team is out, which means they don't plan on being able to get caught back up until the fall. Well, a lot can happen by fall this year if you get my drift based on what's going on right this second. So I wouldn't sleep on stocking up on magazines right now. I would make sure you get what you need, and in my opinion, this was just my personal plan, so take it with what you will, but I at least have 6 magazines for each firearm that I consider to be an active part of my rotation, whether or not that's for concealed carry, or if it's for an actual duty roll of a pistol or something along those lines. 6 magazines is like my minimum, so that's something you should definitely be keeping in mind right now, but at the same time, that's a huge amount of production staff that's out from a manufacturer who provides magazines to all of the top names. The only one that wasn't really listed in that list that is still going relatively strong is Glock. But guess what? Even Glock mags are hard to come by. And don't forget that Washington State recently put a ban on magazines over 10 rounds, and that comes into effect July 1st. And I told you all about this in a previous video, but at the end of the day, you gotta understand that people in that state are buying up a ton of magazines right now that are over 10 rounds, because basically if they own them before the ban goes into place, there's a grandfathering clause that's ready for them to maintain that ownership. So we're fighting a lot of different facets right now as to why these magazines are hard to acquire. But now that Mec-Gar was willing to at least give me that information and let me know that they don't expect to even get caught back up until at least the fall, which I think based on the supply chain and everything else that's been going on in the world for the last 2 years, we know is probably a very, optimistic outlook versus what will probably be reality, I would say get what you can while you can. Now, luckily, I have the Legion model of the P320, so I just ordered some of the Legion magazines for it directly from SIG. The problem there is that they're very expensive. And obviously, you know, if you want to run flush like this, I have to take the mag well off. There's some other things that go into play when it comes to all that. But at the end of the day, this was the last P320 full-size standard capacity magazine in all of Minot, North Dakota. And Minot's not the smallest city in the world, but I know it's not very big either. But that should just tell you that this is something that might be hard to come by here very soon, especially when you're talking about the new sidearm of the military as well as many police forces out there in the country. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, honestly, when it comes to other magazines too, I mean, a lot of them are made by the same manufacturer. So don't be surprised if you find yourself having a hard time getting what you need. And if you haven't noticed, recently I showed many SIG P227 magazines on the workbench. That's because that's a discontinued model, so I stocked up heavily because I don't expect to be able to access those for much longer into the future. And now I'm starting to feel the same way about some of my other firearms platforms just because of exactly what's going on right now. Just a heads up for you. Things to think about, and I definitely want to, you know, stay on track when it comes to getting what we need, because we all know when it comes to preparedness right now, it's kind of hard to keep everything in mind with how overwhelming some of this is starting to become. So I figured a good reminder wouldn't hurt, and if you have any other questions for me, go ahead and leave them in the comments below, and that's going to be it for Magic Prep.